So, back in 1988, Ayatollah Khomeini actually penned this letter, right? And it established a really terrifying precedent.
Oh, yeah. The ultimate blank check for absolute autocracy.
Exactly. It basically said that a single ruler's decree was just above the law, like above the Constitution, above the will of the majority, everything.
Right.
And today, we are looking at a proposed blueprint for a new, supposedly democratic Iran. And, well, we're asking why critics argue it seems to be cashing that exact same blank check.
I mean, a transition of power is arguably the most vulnerable moment in any nation's history. The actual structural mechanisms that get proposed during those really fleeting moments, they basically dictate whether a society is stepping toward freedom or, just swapping the uniforms of its dictators.
Wow. Yeah. So welcome to you, the learner, to today's custom-tailored deep dive. Our mission today is to unpack a really highly detailed audio interview from Radio Irava. We're basically analyzing the arguments of writer and political activist Hadi Mozafari as he dissects this document known as the Emergency Notebook, which is Reza Pahlavi's proposed transition plan for a post-Islamic Republic Iran.
But before we dive into the actual text of that notebook, I mean, we really must explicitly establish some ground rules for today's analysis.
Yeah, please. This is super important.
Right. So this source material contains intensely politically charged viewpoints regarding the current Iranian regime, the former monarchy, and various opposition groups. So we are not taking any sides today. We're not endorsing the viewpoints of the original source, nor are we criticizing them. Our job is simply to impartially guide you through the arguments and ideas presented in Mr. Mozafari's interview, just so you can understand the specific perspective.
Exactly. Thank you for that. We're just the messengers today. And we've got some fascinating stuff to get through. We're going to look at how political vocabulary gets weaponized as a smokescreen. We'll explore some historical anecdotes of women fighting in disguise during the Constitutional Revolution.
Oh, that's a great story.
It really is. And we're going to map out the complex, highly controversial architecture of regime change. So Mozafari's critique actually begins at the most granular level imaginable, the specific words chosen in the notebook.
The vocabulary.
Yeah. He points to the author's reliance on this highly obscure, archaic, pure Persian terminology. So, for example, using the term Samana Gozar instead of, more commonly understood phrases for a transition system.
Right.
And honestly, okay, let's unpack this because my mind immediately goes to the legal strategies used by tech companies.
Oh, like with terms of service agreements.
Yes, exactly. When you sign a term of service agreement, the text is just buried in this impenetrable legal jargon. The goal isn't clear communication.
No,
right?
Not at all.
The goal is obfuscation, ensuring you sign away your data without actually understanding the mechanisms you just agreed to. So, is Mozafari arguing this linguistic choice is a deliberate strategy to hide the actual architecture of the transition?
Well, what's fascinating here is that Mozafari sees a dual purpose behind this vocabulary, and obfuscation is really only half of the equation.
Okay. What's the other half?
He argues that, on one hand, if the general public cannot easily decipher the names and functions of these proposed councils, they won't realize the document is laying the groundwork for a highly centralized dictatorial structure. So it hides the mechanics.
Right.
But the second layer of his theory delves into political psychology. He argues the deliberate purging of common words that have, Arabic or foreign roots. It's an ultra-nationalist posture.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. The authors are basically attempting to signal a hyper-patriotic purity to appear sort of anti-foreign by rejecting common language.
It's like an illusion of linguistic purity that distracts from the actual material conditions of the people. And it's a historical maneuver that we've seen fail before, right? Because the source includes this really striking anecdote about Reza Shah's linguistic purges in the military.
Yes. Mozafari highlights that historical parallel just to demonstrate how these forced linguistic maneuvers often, collapse under their own weight.
Yeah.
So back in the day, Reza Shah's committee attempted to replace common administrative terms like confidential and direct with pure Persian equivalents. And they engineered these terms, Kaznadun and Sikaki.
Kaznadun and Sikaki.
Right, so military officials literally had to stamp critical documents with Kazandu and Sikaki.
Wow.
And it was so profoundly clunky and it was so widely mocked by the public that the military quietly just had to abandon the initiative entirely.
That's hilarious, actually.
It is, but Mozafari uses this to make a really serious point. He argues that obsessing over archaic language while a nation is, bleeding for fundamental rights is a profound political misdirection.
And I think for you listening right now, it's worth thinking about how politicians in your own country use language. Do they use it to clarify their agendas or to obscure them?
It's a universal tactic.
Totally.
Yeah.
So if the language is a smokescreen, what exactly is it trying to hide? Let's look at the actual power structure this notebook proposes. Peeling back that vocabulary reveals a triad of transitional institutions.
Right, the three branches.
Yeah, the National Uprising Institution, the Transitional Government, and the Transitional Court. Now, on paper, this mimics a standard separation of powers. You have a temporary legislative body, an executive branch, and a judiciary, all coordinating to manage the interim chaos.
On paper, sure.
But Mozafari's critique just completely dismantles this facade based on operational reality, because the notebook positions Reza Pahlavi at the apex of all three institutions.
Yeah, and the structural logic of a transition inherently depends on these institutions maintaining independence, right?
Mm-hmm.
They need independence to stabilize the country and draft a new constitution fairly. Mozafari points out that this independence is entirely illusory if a single figure holds the unilateral authority to appoint and dismiss the heads of these branches.
All right.
According to his reading of the text, the document grants Pahlavi the power to veto majority decisions across all these bodies and to act as the uncontested commander-in-chief.
Wait, all without any legally binding oversight mechanisms?
Exactly. No accountability mechanisms whatsoever.
Okay, I want to push back on that critique purely from a logistical standpoint for a second, playing devil's advocate here.
Sure, go ahead.
When a centralized, entrenched state apparatus collapses, the immediate result is a massive, dangerous power vacuum. And historically, rapid transitions often require a temporary, highly centralized executive authority just to keep the lights on,
Yeah.
to prevent sectarian violence, to actually organize the election.
I see what you're saying.
Right, like if you design a transition strictly by committee, you risk endless gridlock while the country basically fractures. So, is it possible the notebook is simply prioritizing brutal efficiency over democratic aesthetics for a limited interim period? Or is this, as Mozafari claims, just a CEO who is also the board of directors and the independent auditor?
Well, if we connect this to the broader arc of Iranian political history, Mozafari argues that temporary efficiency is the oldest excuse in the authoritarian playbook. He doesn't see a pragmatic bottleneck here. He sees a permanent foundation being poured. He argues this structure is a functional mirror of the Vilayat-e-Faqih, the current system of absolute clerical rule.
So just swapping a cleric's turban for a crown.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
And this is where he draws a direct line between the unchecked power proposed for Pahlavi and that 1988 letter from Ayatollah Khomeini we discussed earlier, where the supreme leader's authority just supersedes the law itself.
Mm-hmm.
Mozafari's assertion is that an unchecked executive in a transition invariably becomes the dictator of the new republic. The tools of autocracy cannot build a democracy.
Yeah, that makes sense. And a government that structurally isolates decision-making to a single leader inherently creates a massive disenfranchised periphery. Like if power is concentrated entirely at the top, large swaths of the population are inevitably excluded from the blueprint.
Who is being left at the bottom? Exactly.
Right. And Mozafari identifies two massive demographics glaringly left out of this executive architecture: women and ethnic minorities.
Yeah, and this structural exclusion is really central to Mozafari's warning. He notes a profound contradiction here.
What's that?
Well, despite women serving as the engine of the protests, right, the emergency notebook provides literally no concrete mechanism for their inclusion in the highest levels of transitional executive leadership.
That is wild.
Yeah, and he frames this not just as an oversight, but as the continuation of an entrenched misogyny.
Yeah.
One that's shared by both the current religious establishment and the former monarchy.
Which he grounds in this phenomenal piece of history. I was amazed by this anecdote he shares about the constitutional revolution over a century ago.
It's a powerful story.
It really is. It involves a revolutionary leader, Sattar Khan. So Sattar Khan visits this makeshift hospital to check on his wounded fighters, and he encourages the severely injured young soldier to heal quickly and, get back to the front lines.
Right.
And the soldier motions for him to lean in and just whispers in his ear, "I am a woman."
I mean, wow. women bleeding for a revolution in disguise, only to be marginalized once the power is actually consolidated.
Exactly.
And Mozafari reinforces this historical continuity by referencing Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's infamous interview with Oriana Fallaci.
Oh, I've heard of that.
Yeah, where the former Shah openly dismissed the intellectual and political capacities of women. So for Mozafari, the current regime's constitutional barring of women from the presidency and the monarchy's historical dismissiveness, they operate on the exact same wavelength.
Exact wavelength. And that structural marginalization, it applies heavily to Iran's ethnic diversity as well, because the notebook leans into a rigid command structure dictated exclusively from the capital.
Right, highly centralized.
But Iran's demographics are incredibly complex. It's this vast tapestry of different languages, ethnicities, local cultures. A highly centralized transition inherently strips autonomy from those regions.
And Mozafari details how this strict centralization has historically been weaponized against those minority populations.
How so?
Well, whenever diverse regions have demanded, say, local governance or cultural rights or just economic equity, the centralized state, under both the Shahs and the clerics, has reflexively labeled them as separatists.
Ah, right, separatists.
Yeah, and that label serves a highly specific structural purpose. It manufactures an internal national security threat that basically justifies violent state suppression.
It gives them a blank check to use force.
Exactly. So by failing to integrate pluralism and decentralized power sharing into this transition plan, Mozafari argues the notebook is just preemptively laying the tracks for that identical cycle of marginalization to continue.
Wow. Which brings us to a really harsh logistical reality. If you have a highly centralized system that legally and structurally disenfranchises women and ethnic minorities, who, by the way, collectively make up a vast majority of the population, it cannot govern by consensus.
Right, has to govern through force.
It must govern through force. And that leads directly to the most contentious aspect of Mozafari's analysis, the security apparatus.
This is where things get really intense.
Yeah. The emergency notebook suggests integrating elements of the current military and security forces, like the Revolutionary Guards or the Basij, into the transitional structure. Now, wait, setting aside ideological outrage for a moment, how does an opposition document justify using the very forces they are currently opposing?
Yeah, right, it's a huge question.
I mean, logistically, how does a transition actually secure its borders and maintain internal order without utilizing the millions of personnel already trained in state security? You can't realistically just dissolve an entire nation's military apparatus on day one without inviting total collapse, right?
Sure, and Mozafari acknowledges that logistical hurdle, but he argues that retaining the ideological enforcement arms of a dismantled regime is just institutional suicide.
Okay.
He views this integration not as pragmatism at all, but as a deliberate strategy to secure a new dictatorship. If the goal is absolute control, a new autocrat requires experienced enforcers.
Building a loyal security apparatus from scratch takes years.
Exactly. But co-opting an existing suppressive force takes days. And Mozafari draws a direct parallel to the 1979 revolution to prove this point.
What happened then?
Well, when the clerical regime consolidated power, they did not entirely dismantle the Shah's secret police, Savak. They actually absorbed many of its most effective interrogators and intelligence officers to rapidly construct their own terrifying intelligence machinery.
Oh, wow. So he sees the notebook's proposal as a terrifying historical repeat.
Exactly. And his frustration centers heavily on the profound lack of transitional justice in all of this. He actually compares the proposed integration of these forces to the global pursuit of justice following World War II.
Okay, that's a powerful comparison.
Yeah, he points out that the international community recently convicted a 97-year-old former secretary for her role in a Nazi concentration camp.
Right, I remember reading about that.
The underlying philosophy there is that crimes against humanity do not have a statute of limitations. There's no expiration date on justice.
But in Iran's case...
Right. Mozafari contrasts this enduring pursuit of justice with the current political climate surrounding former regime enforcers in Iran. He is outraged, deeply angry, that former high-ranking Savak leaders like Pervez Sabeti just live freely abroad.
Wait, really?
Yes, and that certain monarchist factions openly march in Europe wearing Savak t-shirts and insignias. So to Mozafari, this rehabilitation of a former secret police force, combined with the notebook's willingness to absorb current suppressive forces, it just signals a total disregard for accountability.
Wow. And that disregard is further emphasized by what the notebook entirely omits, right?
Yes, the silence on the death penalty.
Exactly. Human rights organizations globally have long demanded the abolition of the death penalty in Iran, yet the notebook fails to make any commitment to ending it. Mozafari argues this silence is deafening and entirely strategic.
I mean, a centralized autocratic system requires the ultimate penalty to maintain a baseline of terror. That's just how they operate. Mozafari asserts that a genuine democratic transition must explicitly and immediately disarm the state of its ability to legally execute its citizens. The omission of a death penalty ban is, in his view, just the final piece of structural evidence that the proposed system intends to use lethal violence to secure its grip on power.
Okay, so Mozafari clearly believes this notebook is a roadmap to disaster. His deconstruction of it is exhaustive. He dismantles the language, the architecture, the exclusionary demographics, the security apparatus.
All of it.
But, deconstruction is the easy part of political activism. He aggressively criticizes the Pahlavi faction for relying on external forces, whether that means waiting for foreign military intervention or, hoping for spontaneous magical military defection.
Right. He argues they lack a genuine grassroots engine.
Exactly. So if Mozafari rejects the current theocracy and he entirely rejects this proposed return to a centralized monarchy, what is his actual strategy? What is the mechanical alternative he brings to the table?
Well, he advocates for a framework broadly categorized as the third way. And it's basically encapsulated by the slogan, no to Shah, no to Sheikh.
Okay, no to Shah, no to Sheikh.
Yeah. This philosophy insists that true democratic liberation cannot be parachuted in by foreign powers, nor can it be handed down by an exiled royal family.
Right.
It must be generated by a pluralistic, decentralized front operating on the ground within Iran. Grassroots resistance.
Okay, let's examine the mechanics of that alternative. A decentralized grassroots movement sounds ideal in theory, but how does it organize a transition of state infrastructure against a heavily armed regime without falling into the exact same power vacuums or hierarchical traps Mozafari just criticized?
That's the big question. And Mozafari points specifically to the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the NCRI, and Mariam Rajavi's 10-point plan as the structural blueprint for this third way.
Okay, what does that plan entail?
The mechanics of this plan directly counter the centralization we saw in the emergency notebook.
Yeah.
It completely rejects a single executive bottleneck. Instead, it mandates immediate pluralism.
How so?
Well, it legally guarantees the autonomy of ethnic minorities, which preemptively neutralizes that historical separatist excuse for state violence we talked about.
Oh, smart.
It demands absolute gender equality in political leadership, ensuring women aren't just participants in the revolution, but actual architects of the new republic. And crucially, it mandates the complete abolition of the death penalty, legally stripping the new state of the tools of terror before the transition even concludes.
Wow. So rather than proposing a temporary strongman to manage the chaos, the 10-point plan attempts to codify human rights and decentralization as the very first foundational step, rather than, a luxury to be figured out later.
Exactly. And Mozafari believes that the Iranian public, having endured decades of trauma from both monarchs and clerics, they possess a deep political maturity now. They will not be fooled into accepting another dictator.
They recognize the structural traps of the past.
They do. He believes the population is entirely immune to the illusion of the benevolent dictator, whether that leader wears a turban or a crown. They are demanding a republic rooted entirely in the sovereignty of the people, where power flows upward from the grassroots, not downward from some unaccountable executive.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. It is really fascinating how a single transition document can be interpreted as a necessary, pragmatic roadmap for stability by its architects, and as a terrifying, perfectly engineered trap by its critics.
It really all depends on how you weigh historical precedent against immediate logistical realities. The debate surrounding the emergency notebook illustrates that the mechanics of power are rarely neutral. The institutions a society builds during a transition invariably become the masters of the new era.
Absolutely. And as a final reminder, our focus today has been strictly on unpacking Hadi Mozafari's analysis of this document from his Radio Irava interview. We just hope this exploration has provided you with a deeper, more structural understanding of the specific viewpoint within the wider, highly complex discourse on Iran's future.
Yeah, evaluating the mechanisms beneath the rhetoric is essential for grasping the actual stakes of these political blueprints.
For sure. Which leaves us with a provocative final thought to consider. When a nation tries to completely overhaul its government, by necessity, they have to use the language, the compromised infrastructure, and the surviving personnel of the old regime. It is all they have to work with.
Right.
So how does any society successfully design a transition of power that doesn't just accidentally rebuild the exact same system it is trying to escape? How do you build a bridge to the future when all the available building materials belong to the past?